Hello. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the invite, for the opportunity to speak with you all. I always really appreciate people talking to people across the country in different communities and who are really on the ground doing the work of engaging with voters, educating voters, and advocating for expanded voting opportunities. So really excited to be with you all. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges facing our democracy since the 2020 election and how these challenges are different from vote suppression efforts we've seen in the past, because the challenges in many ways really are unprecedented, and we're only beginning to understand the impact and the long-term implications. And before getting into this, I think it's important to go back to 2020 and understand how different that election was. And the biggest reason why, of course, was the pandemic. Just as COVID-19 upended every part of our lives, it also upended how we run elections. And I think there were really three big questions that came once the pandemic started. One was, how can we make sure that people with COVID or people otherwise afraid of contracting COVID can still safely cast a ballot? Second was, how can we keep voters and election workers safe at polling places? And then three was, how can we do all of this while ensuring that our elections are secure and resilient? And the key to answering all of those questions turned out to be giving voters multiple ways to vote. And I think this is really what we saw across the country to different degrees, was states and counties re-examining their processes, looking for how do we make it easier to vote, how do we create new options to vote safely, or how do we improve our existing voting options. With the two key things being voting by mail, of course, allowing voters to safely receive and cast a ballot without leaving their home, and then early voting, increasing the number of days when voters can cast a ballot in person in order to reduce crowding at polling places. And importantly, expanding voting options helped achieve a number of key goals at the same time. So they not only made our elections safer and more accessible to voters, they also made our elections more secure and resilient. When you have more than one option, when you're spreading voting across a period of time, it reduces stress on our systems. It gives more time to sort of troubleshoot things instead of having everybody casting a vote in person on election day, where once one thing goes wrong, those problems compound throughout the day and you often can never get lines fully down. Another helpful thing is that expanded voting options are nothing new in American elections. They're really central to one of the most important shifts in election administration over the past 3 decades. So I have on the screen, it might be a little bit hard to see some of the individual states, but this is something that is commonly called the snow globe chart. And this chart shows for each state, the share of voters that voted in person on election day at the top, and then the share of voters who voted by mail or early in person in the bottom 2 corners. And in 1996, for example, with a couple exceptions, nearly all voters cast their ballot by going to the polls on election day. But by 2016, you see why it's called the snow globe chart, as states begin trickling down to those bottom corners. And that year, the predominant voting method in 14 states was something other than in-person election day voting. And then in 2020, we really saw states spread out to fill the whole space. In 35 states, something other than election day voting was the predominant method. And in a majority of states, the predominant method was mail voting. And it may be difficult to see, but South Carolina is right near the center of it. So that's an example of a state where there's really balance between all 3 options. And because these alternative voting methods were so well established in many states before 2020, there were ample best practices to borrow from as states sought to expand their own methods or make these methods more accessible and more secure. So I put up some of the common changes that we saw in 2020, expanding the use of online absentee ballot requests, setting up ballot drop boxes so that voters could securely return their ballots without needing to rely on the post office, especially when wait times were longer, processing mail ballots early to avoid counting delays, those sort of practices. And another really important thing was that not only were these things well established, they were also not partisan before 2016. You can see from polling data from 2004 to 2016 that Republicans and Democrats held similar opinions on mail-in early voting and their intent to use those options to cast a ballot. But 2020 was really a turning point here. As political leaders in the Republican Party attacked mail voting in particular, Republican voters followed their lead. And polarization around mail-in early voting really created a dangerous cycle in 2020. As Republican leaders attacked mail-in early voting, their voters became less likely to use these options. And because of that, the ballots cast through mail-in early voting would be overwhelmingly cast for Democratic candidates, which would only deepen suspicion further among Republican voters. And partisan leaders just continued to fan the flames further, creating this spiral downwards and creating an environment in which distrust was almost inevitable at the end of the day. And going forward, this presented an entirely new risk for election administration. As voting methods themselves become politically polarized, the practices become more vulnerable to attack for political reasons. And again, this is obviously vote suppression and legislative efforts to manipulate the election system to favor their voters are nothing new, but we never saw polarization around voting methods in the way that we did during 2020. And we've really seen that this is a trend that seems like it's sticking around based on voting in the 2022 primaries. There's still heavy polarization on which voters use which methods. And this is really why, after an election with the highest turnout in over a century, the lesson for many legislators and advocates is that voting was too easy in 2020. In 2021, legislators across the country introduced more than 440 bills with provisions that restrict voting access, and at least 34 such laws passed in 19 states. And this is the highest number of restrictive voting bills that we've seen since the Brennan Center began tracking voting legislation in 2011. And this trend is not slowing down based on what we've seen so far in 2022. Again, this might be a little bit difficult to see, but looking closely at the bills that have passed, we see a lot of common features. Some of the bills are a continuation of restrictive trends that have been going on for at least a decade, and especially in the aftermath of the Supreme Court striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. For example, a number of bills impose stricter voter ID requirements, or they make it easier for states to remove voters from registration lists. Those sort of efforts haven't gone away. But most of the bills that we're seeing are a direct response to the expanded voting options that voters enthusiastically responded to in 2020. And those include, for example, bills that shorten the time to apply or return a mail ballot, bills that prohibit election officials from automatically sending mail ballot applications to voters, as many did in 2020, bills that limit the availability of mail ballot drop boxes or place limits on how many drop boxes can be made available to voters, and then bills that limit early voting days, hours, or locations. And it's early still to see the impact of those bills, but we're already seeing some effects from the early primaries so far this year. So ahead of Texas's March primary, for example, some counties rejected as many as half of all mail ballot applications because of new rules that the legislature passed in 2021, essentially making the process more demanding to apply for a mail ballot and ultimately more confusing to voters, so that in many cases they didn't know the proper information they needed to supply in order to have their application accepted. In Georgia's elections last fall, the share of mail ballots returned by Dropbox dropped by about half compared to 2020 after a new law limited the availability and hours that voters could use those drop boxes. With Georgia's primary actually going on today and polls closing soon, I'll be looking closely to see if this is a trend that continues as a result of the new law. And we know that the impact of these new laws will not be shared equally by all voters. For example, even before these new bills, studies showed that mail ballots cast by voters of color were rejected at higher rates than those of white voters in Georgia. Voters of color also tend to face longer wait times in polling places across the country, are more likely to be impacted by polling place consolidation, and are less likely to have identification that fits the strict requirements being put in place by legislators. And beyond voters, legislators are also targeting the election officials who successfully pulled off the 2020 election through a historic set of challenges, and who stood up to partisan pressure to cast doubt on the integrity of election results. And again, this is really a very new trend that we haven't seen before. So some examples are bills we've seen that would allow political partisans to seize control of certain aspects of the election administration process that are typically handled by professional election workers. Bills that would allow the state to take over local election administration offices. Bills that would authorize partisan election reviews that are designed for no purpose but to cast doubt on legitimate election outcomes. Bills that would coerce election officials with harsh criminal and civil penalties, and bills that would empower partisan poll watchers at the expense of election workers and really make it easier for those partisan poll watchers to intimidate workers or to interfere in the election process. And it's not just legislatures either. Once overlooked, election officials have become the targets of threats, harassment, and intimidation by conspiracy-driven individuals who refuse to accept the results of the 2020 election. In interviews the Brennan Center conducted after the election, many officials reported that their family members, including elderly parents and children, were harassed using crude language or threatened with violence. Multiple officials told us that they and their families were forced to flee their homes and seek mental health treatment for their children. A nationwide survey of local election officials we conducted earlier this year found that 1 in 6 officials have personally experienced threats. More than half of these officials have been threatened in person. Another important thing we found is that many of these threats, about half, have gone unreported. And this indicates that law enforcement and policy leaders may be underestimating the scope of the problem that election officials are facing, or not doing anything to instill trust that if election officials report this sort of behavior, that something will actually happen because of it. We also found that these threats and harassment are taking a toll on election officials. Nearly a third surveyed said that they personally knew at least 1 or 2 election officials or workers who have left their jobs in part because of fear for their safety. Officials are also concerned about potential staffing shortages in the future, with 3 in 5 saying that they're concerned that threats and intimidation will make it more difficult to retrain or recruit election workers in future elections. And voters are likely to bear the burden of all of this, as election offices lose knowledge and experience at the leadership level, and staffing shortages lead to slower services, fewer polling places, and longer lines. And along with the attacks on election officials and the process from the outside, there's also been a simultaneous increase in the risk of insider threats. Since the 2020 election, there's been an active effort to recruit and convince election workers to facilitate conspiracy theories and use their positions to undermine the election process. And we've seen incidents so far in Colorado, Michigan, Ohio, and a couple other states of election workers allowing unauthorized access to their voting equipment to their other systems by conspiracy theorists in order to spread disinformation about those voting systems. And while these insider threat incidents have been few in number so far, there's every reason to believe that this problem could get worse in the near future. For one, as I've described, election officials are facing far greater political pressure than they have in the past. 63% of local election officials surveyed said that they were somewhat or very worried about interference by political leaders in future elections, compared to just 25% prior to 2020. And nearly 1 in 5 are concerned that election officials will face pressure to certify election results in favor of a specific candidate or party. And second, the election officials we had in 2020 may not be the same people overseeing elections in their jurisdiction in 2024. The combination of threats, harassment, political interference, these new laws directly targeting election officials, and just exhaustion has driven many experienced officials and workers out of the field altogether. 20% of officials surveyed plan to leave their position before the 2020 election, with a third citing political leaders' attacks on a system that they know is fair and honest as one of their top reasons for leaving. And in many cases, the people seeking to fill these open positions are those who have been most activated by the conspiracy surrounding the 2020 election. And this includes candidates who are running for state and local election offices this year, many of whom have openly endorsed and promoted conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. And a majority of state and local election office positions are elected across the country, but it may also include new appointees being selected by political and party leaders who have increasingly made lies about the 2020 election a centerpiece of their platform. So with all that being said, I really try to avoid being hyperbolic or making doomsday prophecies when I do these talks, but I think it's clear that our democracy is facing a real and, again, in many ways, unprecedented challenge in this moment. And it's important to raise the alarm about some of the potential worst case scenarios, even if they're ultimately unlikely to happen, so that we can put in place measures now to ensure they don't happen in the future. At the same time, it's not a moment for giving up. 2020 was an incredibly successful election in achieving historic participation while maintaining safety, security, and officials, both Democrat and Republican, stood up for democracy and thwarted attempts to overturn results at every turn. Even as we see a wave of anti-democracy movement, we're also seeing a flood of support for democracy. While states passed new restrictive laws at a rapid rate in 2021, we also saw at least 25 states enact 62 laws that would expand the right to vote. And these expansive laws are often made voting options introduced in 2020 permanent or more useful for voters in 2022 and other elections going forward. So this includes states expanding early voting, offering greater access to mail ballots, and expanding the use of ballot drop-off locations, as well as a number of other things to make it easier to vote. And then the other thing I just want to say before I move on to questions is, a natural first question is, what can you do? Sort of outside of if you're a legislator or other public policy leader, what can people within their communities do to push back on it? And I think there's a lot that can be done, and that really democracy is a never-ending project that depends on all of our participation to keep it alive. So some of those things that people can do to push back on attacks on democracy include participating in election administration, becoming a poll worker, or in states where election administrators are elected, encouraging people who care about democracy to run for office. Again, the best way to ensure we have people in place who are trying to protect the right to vote, trying to protect the integrity of elections, is by volunteering, by stepping up, trying to fill these positions. And it takes, tens of thousands of people across the country to run an election every year. Second thing is voicing support for current state and local election officials who are standing up for democracy. There's a lot of attention paid to the worst actors, but they are far outnumbered by people who are dedicated public servants and doing everything they can to protect democracy in their positions. Educating voters and talking to members of the public who distrust the election system, and especially spreading information from trusted sources, especially election officials themselves, and encouraging your community to turn to the same for information. And then finally, of course, voting. Vote and encourage others to vote in every single local, state, and federal election in your community, because they all have a bearing on the future of democracy. So I'll stop my presentation there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Derek. We really appreciate the information, and we would like to open the floor for questions. So if you would raise your hand, we will walk a mic over to you so everybody can hear. Lawson.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Can you hear me okay? Is he frozen?
Derek, can you hear her?
Oh, yes, I can hear that clearly.
Okay, you can hear. Okay, here we go. My question for you, and thank you so much for that presentation. My question is, you mentioned the prevalence of lies about the 2020 election. And what I'm assuming you're talking about is the assertion without evidence that voter fraud is prevalent, that there are frauds like that. That's what I'm assuming you're talking about, which I know is a widely held belief. Many people hold that belief, even though there is not evidence to support it. And my question for you is whether you have suggestions for those of us who understand that that is a baseless belief. In talking to people who hold that belief, do you have a sense of what can be an effective way to talk about it?
Yeah, it's, I'll be completely honest and say it's a difficult thing. It's something that I spend a lot of time doing. But at the end of the day, there's such a persistent belief among some people and a real eagerness to believe that in face of any evidence. But that being said, there are people who are persuadable, and in particular, election administration is really complicated, and information about it is not always easily accessible. And so it's natural that people will have sort of questions about how things work. What are the checks in place to ensure this sort of thing doesn't happen? And so that is really what I recommend, is focusing on all of the procedures in place, all of the checks in place that election officials have to, ensure that voters are who they say they are, ensure they're eligible to vote, ensure that they are only submitting one ballot, all of that sort of thing. It's not easy to keep yourself informed of all of these checks in place. The Brennan Center actually does have some resources on this that I can try to share after this call, and then maybe those could be passed on to everyone that I think are really helpful. In particular, we have some guides on mail voting that I think have generated a lot of questions in recent years. But another great place for you to turn to in getting information to help share with others, for you to tell others to turn to, is again, election officials, election workers. From my experience, election workers love showing off their processes. They love explaining all the checks, all the procedures in place. They're typically happy to show you around the office. That's something that I have found really helpful before, is actually just seeing step by step all the things that they do. Again, to make sure that the only votes being counted are those that should be counted. So I think that's my biggest advice.
Other questions? Yes, Ted. Hold on, we're walking the mic over.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I've always thought that a documentary type presentation that educated voters, for example, like a PBS Frontline type presentation would describe the different ways different states vote, like some have all mail-in, for example. And they all have different types of machines and so forth. If it were to explain how mail-in voting, how they have checks and make sure that, that fraud is not a problem with mail-in voting, and not, to present and educate the public about the different types of voting and how fraud is prevented and how they check against fraud, something like that, to educate the voters so that they better understand the process and are less likely to question the integrity once the vote's cast. And that, I'm just suggesting that somebody like the Legal Women Voters, or somebody has that type of program for like South Carolina, or or national, where they talk about the different states. There's something that would educate, because I think a lot of the public kind of realize that voting goes on and they probably trust it, but they don't understand the process itself.
Yeah, and I apologize, you cut out a little bit, but I think I caught most of what you were saying there about the need and the usefulness of having more information out there to educate voters about the process. And one thing that you discussed was having the need to have information for different states, given different procedures, different voting systems, different equipment, all of that. That is something that the Brennan Center is a national organization, and we do the best to produce these sort of materials. But it is always, I think, something really important to keep in mind when trying to do this sort of education is there are very big differences from state to state, and you don't want to sort of innocently spread misinformation or cause people concern because you're talking about a procedure in one state that actually doesn't apply in another state. I think this was actually a huge problem in 2020 because there was obviously a lot of voter confusion in 2020. There were a lot of people, for instance, looking to cast their ballot by mail for the first time in their life. And when there is national media attention on only a handful of states, you might start looking for processes or options that aren't actually available to you. And a lot of people say, well, this is different than what I was told, so there must be something wrong here. So I do think that is a really important factor to keep in mind as well. And this is another reason why, talking to your local election official, other officials in your community who understand these specific processes that are used in your community is so important.
Thank you. There's another hand right behind you.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you know of any organizations that are coming to the assistance of officials who have been threatened. Certainly threatening is, has to be some kind of civil violation, probably not criminal. And I'm wondering, enforcement of repercussions for making threats, would be helpful. Maybe it would contribute to these kind of threats stopping. So do you know of anyone who's doing that work? I'm guessing the ACLU.
I'm not aware if the ACLU is doing this. So there are a couple different things going on. There's a new organization that was actually started for this purpose. I'm blanking on the name. It's something like Election Official Legal Defense Network or something like that, with the very idea of providing, pro bono legal assistance to election officials for various purposes. So there is sort of that going on. And then there are some efforts to try to crack down on these sort of threats against election officials. So there are some states who are passing new laws to create new criminal penalties for intimidating election officials or interfering with the election process. We've seen this in a handful of states so far. And then there is also, at the federal level, DOJ has started an election threats task force with the purpose of investigating these threats, bringing prosecutions. I think we've seen sort of limited impact from that so far, in part because state and local law enforcement is typically better suited to deal with these issues, just given their jurisdiction, given the fact that when election officials do report this sort of threatening activity, they usually go to their local law enforcement, who they have better relationships with. So there's not always a clear indication of who election officials should go to report the conduct. And then also information sharing between different law enforcement is really lacking right now. So we haven't seen a lot of enforcement so far to deter this sort of activity. And then I think another huge hurdle that we're seeing right now is how this sort of activity interferes with First Amendment free speech rights or the perception of those rights. And even though, there is a lot of case law talking about true threats that are specific, that are timely, that are, there are a number of other factors that those can be prosecuted. Sometimes there's just a perception among law enforcement of, look, this is political activity, even if it was, grotesque or horrifying language, that's where you can't do anything about it. And I think there needs to be greater information sharing, certainly, about what laws actually exist to prevent this sort of activity.
Any other questions? Okay. Darren, thank you so very much for taking the time out of your day to share your expertise on this very, very important topic. We have an election coming up in a couple of weeks, and I think a lot of people are probably a little tentative about whether they should be a poll worker or a poll watcher or whatever. So we very much appreciate that, and we'll be happy to share anything that you want to share with us to our membership and our partner organizations. So thank you very, very much. And hopefully we'll be able to get you back again. You did a great job.
Of course. Thank you again for inviting me. And again, thank you for everything all of you are doing to protect democracy, protect voting rights, and make sure that, people are exercising the right to vote there in South Carolina. So thank you so much.